early exchange, shaping policy, advancing development.
And now, still on the Sustainable Development Goals, we want to look at another, directive from the United Nations asking global leaders to ensure that they take bold steps, bold policies towards achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. You're aware that the deadline is 2030, and we're 6 years away from this deadline. The question is, are nations taking bold steps towards achieving these goals as set by the SDG? Let's find out from our guest who joins us virtually. We're being joined by Adebayo Olowo-Ake, who is also a Global Affairs Analyst. Adebayo, glad to have you join us on Early Extinct this morning.
Good morning, and thank you for having me.
Great, good to see you. And I must confess, you're looking good. Glad to have you join us.
Thank you.
All right, let's go to the conversation for this moment. We're looking at another segment or another call from the United Nations talking about the need for nations to take bold steps, bold policies towards achieving the deadline, the targets, the details, and the template set for Sustainable Development Goals. What would be your assessment towards when it comes to dedication among nations as regards achieving these goals? Let me have your assessment first. Then we'll now go to what is required as regards taking bold policies.
Well, when we were, we started off with the Millennium Development Goals, the MDGs, and when the targets set within the scope of the Millennium Development Goals were considered to have been reasonably attained, there was a transition to what we now have, which is the Sustainable Development Goals. So the whole philosophy being that it wouldn't just be sufficient to achieve those milestones. It was imperative to sustain them, and that carries with it a bigger charge to states to ensure that whatever was achieved within the scope of the MDGs was sustained through time. Now, how far have we gone with achieving the goals of the Sustainable Development Goals? Essentially, these targets are targets that are set on a broad scale. The parameters are determined on a global scale. For instance, economic growth, social inclusion, environmental protection, gender equality, and so on and so forth. So this is set on a broad scale, but then it devolves on states to now seek to achieve those goals at their own national levels and at subnational levels. And so each country is responsible for instituting mechanisms for helping to attain those Sustainable Development Goals. In that regard, it will be difficult to be able to provide a holistic assessment of the success rate in achieving those goals because they are done state by state. Each country would have to determine and to look at how far it has gone. But there are some countries that have or that can have a very significant bearing on whether those goals are achieved on a cumulative basis. For instance, countries with a very huge population who therefore carry the bulk of, say, for example, the challenges that have been identified. If you take, for instance, access to education, and you take a country like Nigeria in Africa, you would find that with a population of roughly 230 million, 1 out of every 4 Africans is. So if Nigeria has out of school children, and I think they bandy all kinds of figures around with regard to that. So I'm always very careful when citing figures. But if Nigeria has the highest share of out of school children, then there's a very big challenge that if Nigeria does not put a significant part of those children, a significant population of those children back to school, Africa will lag behind in the assessment of how far it has been able to attain the goals of the SDGs with regard to education. So having given that example, You have countries that have the biggest population, like China, like India, like China, like Indonesia, like Brazil, like Nigeria, like Pakistan. If these countries do not have successes with regard to those specific goals, eradicating poverty, zero hunger, good health, quality education, clean water, gender equality, providing sustainable energy, and so on, then of course the whole world will be lagging behind. So to cut it short, for us to determine the success, we have to evaluate these countries with huge populations, where the bulk of those SDG challenges are.
All right. Now, for this SDGs, there's 17 of them, and it seemed quite a lot for every country to pay attention to all of them. Could that be part of the reason why it seems a struggle trying to achieve the SDGs?
I wouldn't say it's a struggle to attain the SDGs. Um, if you look at the example I just gave, you have to, for example, if you take India, the bulk of the challenges are found in India. India is 1.3 billion. Okay. So if you are able to reduce those challenges in India, you will reduce cumulatively, I'm not very sure now, but about 20% of in certain.
With we hope to reconnect back with our guests in a bit. There's a network challenge there, but he was looking at the population of India, having that huge population. If the country is able to handle and achieve the SDGs in that country, that would have meant attending to a fraction of the population of the world. But the thinking here is this: 17 goals to achieve by 2030, considering the challenges that different countries have and where they are on each goal. For instance, ending hunger. Developed countries may not actually be struggling with that, so that's a given. It doesn't need to take them 2030 to end hunger. You talk about gender equality. Different countries are at varying stages when it comes to gender equality for many reasons. It could be religious, it could be the gap in education. If the UN, for instance, has perhaps streamlined the 17 and maybe made them into maybe 10 or 7, would it have been quite easier for these countries, particularly African countries or less developed countries, to achieve these goals? That's part of what we'll be looking at on the show. But we'll connect with a guest in a bit. In the meantime, I've got Femi, my co-anchor, here in the studio. Is that thinking right to assume that maybe because there are quite many countries are trying to end hunger, they're trying to attend to security, attend to climate change, attend to a lot of things, educational issues?
I think the issue is not just the numbers. Having 17 goals, it's not something that is far-fetched or it's not a big deal. But the question is, when you break down those goals, what are the commitment or the planning that are going into this? You're aware that more problems or more of these issues arise from developing nations or underdeveloped nations, where you have basic issues that have to do with hunger, the issue of the necessities of life. You agree with me that he was talking about what is playing out in India, where the issue of population is also hampering the resources, the financial resources, the facilities that should go into achieving these sustainable development goals. So you observe that the challenges vary from one nation to the other, from one continent to the other. But if you look at our own climate, where the issue of hunger is also pervasive, you have the resolve to tackling hunger, which is also a battle in Africa, because that is basic, it's rudimentary, unlike the other client where those things are taken care of. And so part of these things is also posing challenge to achieving the sustainable development goals. Someone who is hungry, which is the basic, you can't be talking about achieving secondary needs because the basic cannot be met, not to even talk of tertiary needs.
There you get the point.
Yeah.
Some needs there or some goals there are basic or can be considered to be primary because it is still funds that will be committed to every part of it. If we're talking about hunger, then you commit funds to it. You're talking about social inclusion, funds committed to it. You're talking about education, it's the funds committed to it. You're talking about climate change, for instance, it's funds. So if we kind of like separate it for regions, maybe, and say for this particular region, based on their peculiar needs, this should be the goal. Don't you think it will kind of bring the resources that could have been spread around or scattered around into a common pool or into some precise goal, and then they're trying to fight, they give themselves for 5 or maybe even 6, 7 years, and say for now they're fighting hunger, they're fighting unemployment, they're fighting poor education, and some other things that are critical to them. Then make it a one-size-fits-all thing and say all nations of the world should attend to all 17 of these goals. I'm just thinking.
Interestingly, our guest is back, so let's seek his opinion in that regard. I like the fact that you're talking about, resources that are available in pursuing this SDG goals. But let's redirect that to our guest and seek his opinion. Glad to know you're still there with us, Mr. Adebayo. I hope you're there. I hope you can hear me.
Networks will cooperate.
All right. So you were talking about
yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
India is facing as regards to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, talking about the population, which has also ample resources that should have been, devoted to sustaining these initiatives. I would like you to continue your thought in that regard.
Absolutely. The countries I use India as an example, and Nigeria as well, to indicate that countries with huge populations often carry the bulk of the challenges identified in the SDGs. So to the extent that those countries are able to deal with those, attain those milestones, it helps globally to drive the world towards the overall achievement of those identified goals. Now, India has made successes, just like some other countries. You can imagine if we didn't have the SDGs, if we didn't have a common call to work together towards eliminating some of those challenges, maybe we wouldn't have achieved the success we may have achieved as at now, no matter how small those successes can be. But I like the argument, the points made by your colleague when she talked about funding. Funding is critical to the attainment of some of these goals, but not to the attainment of all of the goals. Some of these goals, all that is required is just a change of mindset. For example, if you're talking of a cleaner environment, you don't necessarily need money to achieve a cleaner environment. You might need funds in terms of redirecting your sources of energy, for example, from fossil fuels to cleaner energy like air, like using the sun, like using hydro and so on, But essentially, it's essentially changing the mindset. What is the sanitation conditions like in most of these countries? How are people aware of their responsibilities to keeping the environment clean? Some of those things don't require money. It's just for people to understand that it's wrong to have certain habits which harm the environment. And for those things which require funding, what are the best practices to ensuring that funds that are allocated are judiciously utilized? Which means you have to talk about reducing corruption significantly in order that the bulk of the funds that you have allocated to the attainment of certain targets, are judiciously used. So, national life, which takes a lot of the liquidity of each country. Take, for example, military spending. Until recently, a lot of countries had reduced their military spending. But the security situation in the international system and then in certain regional areas as well have necessitated countries having to increase their defense expenditure. And when you increase your defense expenditure, you naturally are taking that money from other sectors. You take a bit from education, from health, from everywhere else to put into defense or security so that you can deal with the challenges that you have there. So are there things that can be done to make the world a more peaceful place? Are there better ways of resolving conflicts that would not require a recourse to the battlefield? So these are also elements that states have to look at. But sometimes, especially in terms of defense and security, you may need states to pool resources together, in order to address those issues. They may not be issues that can only be addressed unilaterally, but they may have to be addressed bilaterally or multilaterally. So there are so many things, which can be done to enhance the attainment of those goals. And if I might add as well on the totality of the number of the goals, I don't think that 17 goals are too many. Because you see, ordinarily, when each country does its budget for the year, and if you look through those budgets, you would find that they are a reflection of most of those 17 SDG goals, even if we were not talking of the SDGs, because every country wants to make sure that children can go to school, educate the population, there's a cleaner environment, that all segments of the population have access to resources, access to education, based on what their constitution provides for equality, of everyone to resources, equality of everyone before the law, and so on and so forth. So you would always find more than those 17 goals in the budgetary provision or the philosophy behind the budgets of every state. So I don't think those 17 goals are too many. I think the strength of coming together to have these SDGs is just to put a challenge on states that we want to generally focus on these issues from a global perspective and try to motivate and generate a momentum that will help each state to take its responsibilities seriously towards achieving those goals.
Let's look at specifically now the call from United Nations for global leaders to take bold policies, bold steps. Now let's look at the goals one after the other, which is the first one to tackle the issue of hunger and achieve zero hunger by the year 2030. If you are to advise, what are the bold policies you think global leaders should take towards achieving zero hunger? Are we going to have a time where we will have zero hunger, given the deadline 2030? There's another part to this, which is the financing. An agency did an estimation that it will take about $325 billion to tackle the issue of poverty between now and the year 2030. The question is, where will this money come from? So my question is, when it comes to the issue of decision and the issue of resources, what are the bold policies you will expect from global leaders when it comes to the issue of hunger or poverty?
Thank you very much. For hunger, I think perhaps to simplify it, I would identify two approaches. One approach is national, which means the state must take all necessary measures, including training the right kind of manpower, agricultural experts, understanding its agricultural environment and landscape, facilitating provision of fertilizer, all tools that are required, all resources that are required to enhance food production, okay? And then also built into that is security. If you take the case of Nigeria, if we do not deal with banditry, effectively deal with banditry or insurgency where it still exists, we are basically wasting our time, because we know that unfortunately the food basket of Nigeria is the most affected by banditry. So it's a no-brainer that if you don't deal with that problem, you cannot address, and we are already feeling the consequences in Nigeria, because not only are we already caught up in that problem, but we are also caught up in the problem of the weakening of the national currency, which reduces the purchasing power of the citizens. So there's what each state, I've just used Nigeria as an example, what each state needs to do with regard to that. Now, with regard to also attaining zero hunger, there's something which the international system must do as well. This recourse to a battlefield solution for every disagreement must be significantly reduced. You see, the international system has moved away from multilateralism, negotiation, arbitration, congresses and summits and conferences designed to articulating challenges and resolving them, right? Rather, in the last 5 years or 6 years, we have seen an accelerated descent into a situation in which at the drop of a hat, countries are already exchanging fire over minor issues, which diplomacy should be resolving. And why do I say this? If we don't go back to multilateralism and relying on institutions that have been set up for that purpose, like the United Nations, the African Union, the Arab League, the Organization of American States, and so on, to deal with disagreements between and within states, we will continue to go to war for very minor reasons. And when you go to war, you disrupt the international supply system. You may disrupt the international supply system. And that international supply system includes not only energy supplies, crude oil deliveries around the world, but also food deliveries. And here the most potent example will be the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. And you could see how that disrupted global supply of wheat, because between Russia and Ukraine, they probably provide 50 to 60% of global consumption of wheat. So once they cannot resolve their differences, diplomatically, and each country has a right to determine what its national interests are, what its security interests are, but where those interests collide, then they should be resolved diplomatically. And their allies, the allies who support these countries, whichever those countries may be, should not always encourage them to fight. They should encourage them to resolve these issues diplomatically, because the more conflicts you have, the more likelihood it is that you would disrupt the international food supply chain, which will now exacerbate the problem of hunger.
Since we're looking at innovative ways for achieving the SDGs, I'm going to lump these 3 SDGs in one and ask you for what innovative approach can be used to achieve them. One of them talks about health and well-being, and the other is clean water and sanitation. And then the third one talks about responsible production and consumption, which we can link to circular economy, which the world right now is advocating. In what innovative way can less developed countries try to achieve these goals?
Wow, that's a double barrel question. Let me try. I think, first of all, we need to pay attention to the young population, because the young population are very good at innovation, or could be very good at innovation. The older population is used to doing things in a certain way, and it will be difficult for the older population to change. Some are open and receptive to new ideas and new ways of doing things. But we know from history and from reality that in many countries, the younger population is often a lot more open to looking at problems from a different perspective and coming out with innovative approaches for resolving those problems. So we need to give opportunity to the younger population. A country like Nigeria, where you have roughly about 150 million Nigerians who are below the age of 30, the political elite needs to understand that you cannot wish away not giving the younger Nigerian population access to a lot of things, including seeing how innovative they can be. And for them to be innovative, they have to have education. They have to have exposure, which will tickle their imagination. So that's one. And this recipe is for every country. So yes, helping, empowering the younger population to be innovative, and they will come up with solutions. The second thing that I will propose is for what we call clean energy or clean water. We need to, I believe that right from our traditional practices have always been pro-environment. You go to any culture, whether in Europe, whether in Asia, whether in Africa, especially in pre-colonial times, Asia in pre-colonial times, our pre-colonial socio-economic reality was essentially pro-environment. We did not eat or engage in destroying the environment. Everything was natural and organic, right? So there's nothing There's nothing too big or too difficult for us to do in trying to go back to some of those ways. Maybe not all of them, but to most of them. The second thing is some of the commitments we have made within the scope of the SDGs, may not be in our interest at the moment. And I'll quickly clarify what I mean by that. If you take a country like Nigeria that has abundant fossil energy, right? We have crude oil, we have gas. In fact, we have 2.5 times gas reserves than we have crude oil reserves. For a country like Nigeria, it might be more economically sustainable for us to build thermal power stations, for example, because we have an energy problem. So it might be a lot more easier for us to build thermal power stations because we have abundant gas, which is just there. And we need the gas to generate electricity, But perhaps with a younger population that is more innovative, we can look at how our own thermal stations can be more environmentally friendly rather than just totally abandoning thermal energy, which I think is some of the commitments that some developing countries have made within the scope of the SDGs, which is making it difficult to achieve that. Because even the big boys, pardon my using that expression, many of the big boys are not even performing in terms of the commitments they have made. The Paris climate obligations that were entered into, you take a country like China, you take a country like India, you take a country like the United States, they pollute the environment more than the rest of us by a stupendously wide margin. So asking us now to give up thermal energy or fossil fuels because we have commitments under the SDGs, I think is something which the political elite needs to revisit, okay, simultaneously as well as they look at how our own engineers, our own young innovative population can devise thermal power generating systems that are eco-friendly. Now, in terms of health, and here, okay, I was working in several countries. I had the opportunity of comparing the health systems. I would say that Nigeria used to do so well, in terms of its healthcare sector. There was a time when Nigerian doctors were the ones who actually engineered the health system of countries like Saudi Arabia. They had to depend on Nigerian doctors, but we suddenly have declined from that point to where we are now. The strength of our health system was the primary health care. And strangely, under the military governments, we had remarkable primary healthcare systems. Professor Olukoye Ransom-Kuti is one of the globally recognized icons in the delivery of efficient primary healthcare systems. And when your primary healthcare system is solid, you are most likely going to have less problems, down the chain of the healthcare system. So we have to go back to looking at why our primary healthcare system was good. And we don't need to look at any foreign country. We already achieved it in Nigeria. So we need to look at that. Other countries in the developing world who may have had the same successes need to go back and revisit those things they were doing that were good and just simply reintroduce them. And in those areas where they were not performing, they now need to investigate what they need to do better. And in this case, they can look at other countries that are doing far better than them and borrow a leaf from those countries. I think these are just some of the ideas, that we can interrogate in an attempt, towards helping us achieve the sustainable development goals in those 3 areas you mentioned.
All right, that's quite interesting. Now, let's talk about the issue of funding gap. We've talked about the issue of commitment, the issue of both policies, but let's talk about some of the issues we started with, and perhaps we're going to wrap up with that, which is the funding gap that exists when it comes to SDGs. Now, according to a report, conducted in this regard, the funding gap has been estimated to cost between 2.5 trillion and 4 trillion US dollars. Now, my question is, to address this funding gap that exists as regards to achieving these sustainable development goals, what are the decisions you would expect from global leaders, most importantly for developing countries who are battling with the issue of financing more than any other continent. Your take quickly.
As a person, I'm always very reluctant to just take figures that are bandied about. I myself have been in situations where I've been part of teams that develop some of these things. So I'm always very reluctant to just accept figures. And I'm not discrediting the figures. I'm just saying that sometimes those figures, and depending on who is developing those parameters and those budgets, we may need to revisit those figures. But I think one easy way to get away from the problem is, now, when these figures have been 2.5 trillion, what would each country require? An honest assessment by each country. What will they require for them to be able to achieve those goals? I think that way we can run away from the figures. But the figures give us a perspective and they help us to plan. I think first of all, we have to eliminate waste and gaps. Usually, when budgets are made across many countries, there are often too many gaps and wastages. I think if states consciously work towards eliminating gaps, I think then we can come up with realistic figures, that can easily be, not easily, but at least that can be generated. The second thing is, how best can we make use of our own expertise? Because when you use foreign expertise, it costs you a lot more money. For the attainment of some of these goals, maybe consultants are needed to do assessments, to do investigation, to provide certain recommendations. Do we have Nigerians? Do we have Ghanaians? Do we have Indians who are experts in those fields? And who will be interested in delivering their expertise, towards those services, and therefore help the state to reduce costs? So I think because of time, if we look at these two critical aspects, reducing wastages and gaps, relying more on domestic or indigenous expertise, I think we can cut down on some of those costs, which are a guide, towards helping us achieve the SDGs.
Quickly, I'm just going to ask, we're just 6 years away from the time set for the achievement of this SDGs. What would be your word of advice to countries, particularly developing countries and even developed ones, in assisting to ensure that 2030 becomes a reality?
I'll have just one advice. I think we should review the timeline. To be very honest, I think we should review the timeline. 6 years, they are pretty short. And in the last 5, we have had major disruptions, especially in the international security environment, which has impacted us at sub-regional or continental levels, whether in Asia, whether in Africa, now even in Europe. So I think a realistic advice would be, guys, can we sit down and review this timeline? Can we move it to 10 years instead of 6 years? Because frankly, I don't think 6 years, those 6 years are realistic enough.
Adebayo Olowo-Ake, who is a Global Affairs Analyst, for being a part of Early Exchange today. Your submissions have been quite valuable. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
We'll close the show here today. Thank you for watching. We ask that you be a part of it again tomorrow, 8 a.m. West African time. The conversation continues with you. Please leave a comment when you visit our YouTube channel at Sook News TV or any of our pages on different platforms, Facebook, Instagram, and X at Sook News TV. I am Blessing A.J. And do not forget that Market Insight comes up at 11 here on Sook News TV. Enjoy your day.
Yes, indeed, we're wrapping up the conversation, but it continues on all our social media platforms. Just search for Sook News TV. There you find us. Don't forget, at the exchange, we always return bigger and better. I will always count on your support for that to be and for us to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals as we shape policy every day. I am Femi Ayodele. Thanks for watching. I'll see you tomorrow.
Early exchange, shaping policy, advancing development.